Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Dalet. The Mishnah taught Dineh Mamonot Hakol Vechule. In monetary cases, everybody who's present at the trial can offer arguments both ways for guilt or for innocence. However, in a capital trial, then the people that are in the audience can offer arguments for acquittal, but not for guilt. And now the Gemara asks, Hakol afilu aidim, when you say that everyone in attendance, so certainly that would be the students, but what about the witnesses themselves? This is the witnesses that came in and said, this person is guilty, he has to pay, or he has capital punishment, depending on the case. Can those witnesses themselves offer arguments and say, listen, I know I just said testimony about guilt, I want to add a reason for guilty. Or the other way, even though I just said testimony that this person, right, borrowed money, owes money, killed someone, I want to offer argument for innocence. So can they also offer arguments or traditions, whatever they think of? If so, if you say that witnesses can offer, and that is what the Mishnah said, then it would seem that our Mishnah follows the minority opinion of Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbanan, which would be strange. We would expect our Mishnah to be the majority opinion. Now, where do we see their machloket? In the following Baraita Detanya. Ve'ayed echad lo ya'aneh benefesh, ben lizchut, ben lechova, tanakama, which represents Chachamim, Rabbanan, of this, in this Baraita, quote a pasuk that says, one witness shall not testify against a person. And so we learn from that, of course, one witness cannot testify. We know that from other places. We learn something else from this pasuk, that not only can one witness not testify, but also that a witness cannot offer any other reasons for guilt or for innocence. They cannot offer arguments at all. The witnesses are there just to testify whatever they saw, and then thank you very much. It's not in their position to offer other arguments. That's Tanakama. That would not be consistent with our Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda omer oneh lizchut ve'en oneh lechoba. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says that the witnesses themselves can offer arguments for acquittal, but not for guilt. We're going to see their derivation is from a capital punishment case. So that's why they're saying only for acquittal, not for guilt. And that would match up with our Mishnah that says the same thing for a capital case. And presumably, if it was a monetary case, then the Yosef Rabbi Yehuda would say, yes, they can argue both ways, just like our Mishnah. So it seems that our Mishnah is the minority opinion, but that's a bit problematic. Amar Papa be'achad min hatalmidim v'divrei hakol. So Papa explains, no, when our Mishnah says that anyone in the audience can offer arguments, was not referring to the witnesses. Indeed, the witnesses cannot offer arguments as Rabbanan say. And when the Mishnah says people in the audience can offer arguments, it was talking about the students that are in attendance. That's where it says in the capital case only for acquittal. In a monetary case, they can go both ways. But indeed, witnesses cannot, according to Chachamim, and our Mishnah is in accordance with Chachamim. My Tamad Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. And now that you mentioned this Baraita, what is the source for Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda who says that they can testify? The Amar Kera'ed Echad Lo Ya'aneh Benefesh Lamut. Lamutu de'eno oneh aval lizchut oneh. Because the pasuk says one witness shall not testify against someone to put him to death. And again, we're making this refer not to testimony itself, but to arguments. So that means that he cannot offer arguments only if it's going to be for guilt, to give him capital punishment. But if it's for innocence, then he can. That would be true in a capital case. And presumably in a monetary case, he could offer arguments both ways. So that's Rabbi Yosef's argument, proof that witnesses can offer arguments. V'Rabbanan, and what is Rabbanan going to do with this pasuk? Amarash Lakish mishum demechzeh kenogeya be'ayaduto. Before we get to what they're going to do with this pasuk, what's their reasoning? How come Rabbanan think that a witness cannot testify at all, not even for innocence in a capital case? Because it seems he is biased in his argument, that he has something to gain from it. Now, what does a witness have? He's not a relative, so he's not going to gain money from this. What does he have to gain? It's as follows. When a witness comes and says, I saw this guy murder, I saw this guy violate Shabbat, whatever it is, and he deserves capital punishment. So he has to testify because that's the law. If you witnessed a crime, you have to say so. But most people would not really want someone to get capital punishment on their account, because now the family is going to be resentful and hate him. Maybe they'll try to take revenge. Who knows? Maybe there's some maybe he'll be found to be an ed zomem if someone saw him or thinks they saw him in another place. It's kind of dangerous to get involved in a capital case, and you're responsible for the killing of that person. Who wants it on their head? And therefore, even though he just testified, yes, I saw this guy murder someone, he deserves capital punishment, but he may then try to make up arguments for acquittal because he doesn't want to be responsible for that person actually getting capital punishment. And therefore, the witness himself, although he's trustworthy, obviously, to give testimony, he's not trustworthy, he's not unbiased to offer arguments, and therefore he cannot issue arguments in either direction. Now, what do the rabbis do with that pasuk that says that a witness cannot offer arguments for guilt, which would imply that he can offer arguments for innocence? Oh, he says this is talking about the students. The students in a capital case can offer arguments not for guilt, but yes, for innocence. And it says it follows the interpretation in the following braita, that if one of the witnesses says, I have a reason to acquit this person, how do you know that we don't listen, we don't care? This is according to Chachamim, that we don't accept the testimony of the arguments of a witness, no matter what, because it says one witness cannot testify. We're taking again testify as issue arguments. He testified, we accept his testimony, but he can't issue arguments, not even for innocence. And regarding a student, if a student in a capital case wants to issue arguments for guilt, we also do not listen to him. How do we know? So you see, we take off the first word of the pasuk, right? The pasuk is ed echad. So we read the middle words twice. So at the beginning we read ed echad lo ya'aneh, which means a witness and two witnesses, doesn't matter how many, any witnesses cannot or issue arguments. Either way, we leave out the word lamut. And then in the second usage, we leave out the word ayed and read lamut. So it says echad, anyone, meaning any of the students, anybody, any of the bystanders in the court, cannot issue arguments lamut, for guilt, but they can for innocence. This is a very creative way of using this pasuk in two ways to teach two things, either including the first word and excluding the last word, or the other way around. And by doing both of those, we can learn both of these laws, that a witness, according to Chachamim, cannot issue arguments at all, but a student can in a capital case for acquittal, but not for guilt. The Mishnah said that in monetary cases, if a judge argued for guilt, he could change his mind for innocence, and if he argued for innocence, he can change his mind for guilt. He can go both ways. However, in a capital case, he can only change his mind in one direction. If he originally argued for guilt, he can change his mind and say, you're innocent. But originally, if he gave an argument for innocence, he has to stick with that position and continue arguing for innocence, and he cannot change his mind for guilt. In a way, this will ensure that at least if someone started off with innocence, he would continue trying. Remember, there's no lawyers there, so there's no defense lawyer that will argue on the defendant's behalf. But if you have a judge who cannot change his mind, so then he's going to have to keep looking for arguments for innocence. And hopefully through that, if there are any really good arguments, then he'll come up with it and offer them and try to convince the other judges. And that way, if they're convinced, good. If they're not convinced, then they'll vote for guilt. But this way, it'll ensure that probably one or many judges will argue for innocence, and they can't even change their mind. They have to argue that the whole time. Amar Rav, lo shanu ela b'shat masa umatan, aval b'shat gemar din, melamed zechut, choser umelamed chova. Rav says this law in the Mishnah only applies during the deliberation, when the judges are sitting and they're arguing back and forth. However, when it comes time to vote in the verdict, then they can change their mind. And even if he was arguing for acquittal, during the deliberation, if during that time, during the deliberation he can't change his mind, he can only offer arguments for acquittal. But if during that time he's listening to the people who say guilty and say, you know what, their arguments are more convincing, then at the time of the verdict, he can change his mind and say that the person is guilty, and certainly can change his mind the other way. So that's what Rav is saying, that the not changing the mind rule only applies during deliberation. And it makes a certain amount of sense, because during the verdict you have to decide, you have to give a decision, a vote for what you think. And if you think the person is guilty, how could a person vote innocent if they really think he is guilty? It's one thing during deliberation to say, well, let me offer an argument. Let's try this out, see if it's convincing. You can offer an argument even for things that you're not yet convinced of. But once you have a verdict, so you have to tell the truth, whatever you really think, during the verdict. And so then you could try and change your mind the other way. Okay, now we're going to have 4 challenges, attempted challenges against Rav. But we're going to answer them. The first one is from a Mishnah coming up later. Lemachzorat mashkimin uba'in, hamezakeh omer ani mezakeh umezakeh ani bimkomi, hamchayev omer ani mechayev umechayev ani bimkomi. We're talking about a case where they came together on the first day for a capital case, and the vote came out 12-11 guilty. Now, 12-11 guilty, we don't kill him based on one vote, or actually even if it's more, even if it's 22-1 guilty. We don't kill him on the first day. We say, okay, the vote is for guilt, we have to sleep on it, and everybody comes back the next day after they think about it, and then we see, well, where does everybody stand? Did anybody change their minds? So that's what this Mishnah is talking about. On the next day, they wake up and they come. The one who said innocent before will say, I said innocent, and I remain in my position. I'm not changing my mind. In fact, he can't change his mind. And the one who says guilty says, I said guilty yesterday, and I remain in my position. So it could be that they all remain in their position, and then they'll just reaffirm their votes. And then if he wins by 2, if the guilt wins by 2, then he will get capital punishment. The Mishnah continues and says, Hamelamed chova melamed zechut, aval melamed zechut. The one who said guilty yesterday, who was arguing for guilt yesterday, he can change his mind on the second day after they sleep on it and say, after thinking about it, you know what, I argue for innocence. He can change his mind that way. However, the one who argued for innocence cannot change his mind to argue for guilt. That's what the Mishnah said. Now the Gemara brings the question. On the second day, what are they doing on the second day? That's the verdict. They discussed it and deliberated all day on the first day. The vote came in towards guilt, so they came back, so it's everybody sleep on it. They come in the second day and they're voting. And you see, this Mishnah says that during the time of voting, one can change his mind for innocence, but one cannot change his mind for guilt. That's exactly against Rav, who said at the time of the voting, you can change your mind in either way. That's the challenge against Rav. The answer is, wait a second, are you trying to say that on the second day there is no deliberation? Of course there's deliberation. That's the whole point. We sleep on it so that the next day they can come in, they'll restate their positions and argue and say, listen, yesterday I was convinced by this argument, but now I changed my mind. What do you think? So the whole point of sleeping on it is to present new information, new possibilities that they thought of overnight. And they have to share it with everybody else and deliberate further. So on the second day also, there is deliberation and then the verdict. So when the Mishnah is saying that one cannot change his mind from innocence to guilt, is talking about the time of deliberation. But indeed, at the time of the verdict, then one can change his mind either way. Tashema, second challenge against Rav. Tanin elu keneged elu ad shireh echad min hamechayibin dibrei hamezakin. So the continuation of that Mishnah says that if the vote turned out to be 12 guilt, 11 innocent, now you have to win by 2, and they only won by are up by 1. The guilty party is only up by 1. So we make them continue arguing one against the other until one of the people who said guilty will change his mind to say innocent. If they change their mind, if you flip one vote, then it'll be 12 innocent and 11 guilty, and a simple majority is sufficient to let the guy go free. And so they have to keep arguing until that happens. Otherwise, it's going to be a deadlock. If it ends up being a deadlock, then we add 2 more. If it was 23, we bring 2 from the bench, from the students, and we add more, and we continue adding more until we get a majority for innocence or a majority by 2 for guilt. Now, notice that the Mishnah said they continue arguing until one of the guilty says innocent. If one could, according to Rav, he said that you can switch both ways. If so, then the Mishnah should say if either one of the guilty says innocent, or if one of the judges who said innocent before says guilty, because Rav said they can vote no matter however they want at the time of the verdict. But the Mishnah only says one way. That's the challenge against Rav. And the answer is Tana zechut kamehadar, achova la kamehadar. The author of this Mishnah is seeking out innocence. So that's why when he gives an example, it says, well, let them try to deliberate, and hopefully, this is what he's hoping for, is that one will find innocent. Because in general, we don't want to kill people, and we're not seeking out that someone should change his mind towards guilt. But theoretically, if someone does change his mind for guilt, they can do that. Rav is correct. And so therefore the Mishnah is not saying to limit that you can only change your mind one way, you can change your mind either way at the time of the verdict. But when it gives this example, it wants to try to be nice and be merciful, and hopefully we can find a reason to acquit. Ta Shema, third challenge against Rav. Tamar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina is a beraita. Echad min hatalmidim shezika v'met ro'ino toki ilu hai ve'omed b'imkomo. Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina teaches that, let's say there was a student in the room. We learned that students can offer arguments, and if a student offers an argument for innocence, in a capital case, they can only give arguments for innocence. And if the Bet Din accepts it, then we promote the student to come and be a judge. So now he's one of the judges. The same law would be true if one of the judges themselves said innocent and then died before the vote. So what do we do in that this person died? So we assume as if he's alive. We count him as one. Even though he's dead, we know that he argued for innocence, and so we count him as one even though he's dead. That's what the Braita says. And now here's the challenge. According to Rav, that you can change your mind either way, how could we count a dead person as one vote? We should say, if he were alive, maybe he would change his mind from innocent to guilty, right? If you could go from innocent to guilty. So for the fact that we still count him, that means we're not following Rav. That once he said innocent, he cannot change his mind, even at the verdict. Since he couldn't possibly change his mind, even if he were alive, therefore we should count him as one, even if he's dead. You can only count him if he's dead, if he couldn't even change his mind, were he alive. But if he, according to Rav, if he could change his mind, how could you count him? Maybe he would change his mind and say guilty. That's the question. The answer is hashtami hala darbe. Okay, but until this point, he didn't change his mind. So you know what? We stay at the status quo. The last thing we heard him say was innocent. If he were alive, you're right, he could change his mind. But now he's dead, so he can't change his mind anymore. And so we'll assume the status quo. Most likely, he would stay the same, and that's why we can count him as innocent, even though if he were alive, indeed, he could change his mind. And so that's no problem. Okay, now that, although that is a possible solution, logically we have a problem, because there was a message sent from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel that said, according to the Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, this baraita, we exclude Rabbeinu. Rabbeinu is Rav. In other words, the message from Eretz Yisrael is that there is no way to reconcile Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina with Rav. So although you found a logical way to reconcile it, but it's not necessarily true. And in Eretz Yisrael they said it's a problem. And now Rav is going against a baraita. So we bring up back the question and we answer it. En Musa itemar. You heard the tradition from Eretz Yisrael wrong. They didn't say mutza, they said the opposite. En mutza. You missed the word en. And in fact, they said the opinion of Rav is not excluded by the opinion of Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, meaning they are reconcilable according to the logic that we just stated. So there is no problem. Tashema, and the last challenge against Rav from a baraita. שני סופרי הדיינים עומדים לפניהם, אחד מן הימין ואחד מן השמאל וכותבים דברי המזכין ודברי המחייבים. During the deliberation, in the capital case, there are two court stenographers, court scribes, and they stand before them, one on the right and one on the left, and they write down all the arguments of those who say for acquittal, and the other one writes down all the arguments for liability. We have to keep a record of the arguments this way and the arguments that way. That's what the Baraita taught. The question is, why do we have to keep a record of all the arguments? Okay, we understand why we need a record of the arguments for guilt. Because, let's say we have a lot of arguments for guilt. Let's say there's 5 different arguments for guilt. And now they vote and they find the majority is guilty. Okay, we have to sleep on it. We come back the next day. Now, on the next day, they might say, listen, 2 of these arguments, 2 of the 5, we reject. We don't like them anymore. But someone thinks of another argument for guilt that they didn't think of the first day. If that happens, they have to sleep on it yet another night, because they can't just vote on it just because it's the second day. Since they're voting on a new line of reasoning, in order for that line of reasoning to be acceptable, they have to think about it again overnight to make sure it really stands the test of time. And so we have to keep a record of all the arguments and exactly what they are, what their sources, so that on the second day, if someone presents an argument, we can check to see, is this a new argument or an old argument? If it's an argument that they already heard the first day, they won't have to sleep on it again. But if it's a new argument that they didn't hear the first day, then they're going to write it down and say, oh, let's sleep on this one also. So that's why it's important to keep a record of the arguments for guilt. But when it comes to the arguments for innocence, what need is there to write them down? Is it not because if there was someone who argued for innocence on the first day and voted that way on the first day, and then they come in the second day and they say, oh, you know what, I changed my mind, I want to vote for guilt. Is it not that we don't pay attention to them? That's why we have to write them down. We have to write down who said innocent the first day to make sure if they come in the second day and they try to change their mind, we tell them, no, you can't. You said innocent the first day. You cannot change your mind, even at the time of the verdict. This is a challenge against the Rav, who says you can change your mind. If you can change your mind either way, then why bother writing down the arguments of those and exactly who said innocent? What's the difference who said innocent yesterday, since you say, Rav, that they can come in today and vote for guilt? So the answer is, Lo kedeshe lo yemeru shenayim tam echad mishene mikraot. Rav could say, do you know why we write down the arguments for innocence? Because we want to make sure that we don't have 2 judges that are giving the same reasoning, one reasoning, but quoting 2 different pisukim. What's wrong if they quote two different pisukim to back up the same argument? Here's the problem. Let's say 2 judges give one argument, but one quotes a pasuk A and one quotes a pasuk B to back up that argument. Do you count that as 2? And he said, no, you only count it as 1. Why? Because one of their arguments has a problem with it. We're about to learn that one pasuk can teach many things, but there's a law of non-redundancy. You cannot have 2 pasukim that both teach the same thing, because then why would you need 2 pasukim? The Torah is not redundant. And if you have 2 different judges, they're arguing, giving the same argument, but one quotes one pasuk, one quotes the other pasuk, one of their derivations is wrong, because we only need one pasuk to teach it, not 2 pasukim. Since one of their derivations are wrong, their argument is thrown out, is cancelled, and therefore we only count one of them and not both of them. That's why we have to write down their arguments, so that then we can go look at them over and compare them and say, look, these 2 judges, they gave the same line of reasoning, but they quoted two different Pesukim. So therefore we count it only as one. One Pasuk is right. The other Pasuk is obviously not the derivation of that law. So this is going to lead us to a very interesting sugya about the methodology of Midrash. How do you know that you cannot derive the same one idea from two different Pesukim? Amar Abaye Amar Kera Achat Iber Elohim Shetayim Zu Shamati Ki Oz Lelohim. A pasuk from Tehillim that says Hashem has spoken once, twice I have heard. In the Peshat, this is a step-up parallelism. The first half of the pasuk you say one thing, and the second half of the pasuk you say the same thing, but with a greater emphasis. So this happens with numbers a lot. In the beginning, you say sometimes you say 3, and then the second half you say 4, like Pesukim and Amos. Here it's Hashem spoke 1, I heard 2. That's the simple Peshat. This is parallel. But the Midrash is saying differently. Hashem spoke one thing, meaning one pasuk. I heard 2, meaning I can derive multiple meanings from one pasuk. This is called the principle of polysemy. Pali meaning many, semi meaning meanings, right? Many meanings from one pasuk. Because Hashem's word is so powerful that it can encode multiple layers of meaning. So we learn from this, Mikra echad yoseh lechama ta'amim, ve'en ta'am echad yoseh mikama mikra'ot. One pasuk can emerge into many explanations, right? There are many valid explanations of pasuk, many applications. You can learn many laws from one pasuk, as we often do. But the opposite is not true. You cannot have multiple laws you cannot have one law, rather, that comes from multiple Pesukim. Right? Pesukim are so powerful that one Pasuk can teach you multiple laws. So if that's true, then certainly that's the principle of polysemy. Then certainly you cannot have redundancy, because the Torah is very powerful. Why would it repeat itself? And therefore that's the law of non-redundancy, that you cannot have one law that's taught multiple times in Tanakh. This is why you have many times throughout the Talmud Bavli, if one sage derives a certain law from a certain pasuk, and then you have another sage that derives it from a different pasuk, we'll ask, well, you derived it from a pasuk, what are you going to do with the first pasuk? And what is this sage going to do with the other pasuk? Because we're assuming that you can't have two pasukim that teach the same law. So if you derive it from this pasuk, then the other pasuk is empty, is free. So you have to use that for something else. Okay, that's the dirasha of Abaye, the Amorah from Bavel. Ishmael Tana. And now we quote a Baraita. Notice, however, that this Baraita is only going to back up the principle of polysemy, not the principle of non-redundancy. And this Baraita says, Uchfatish yefotzes sala. Quoting pasuk in Yirmiyah, that Hashem's word is like fire and like a hammer that breaks a rock into pieces. Ma patish ze mitchalek lecha manisosot, af mikra echad yoser lecha mata'amim. The simple reading of the pasuk is, Hashem's word is so strong, it's like a hammer that can break a rock and the rock smashes. So too Hashem's word is very powerful. The analogy of the derasha is slightly different, because we don't want to break things. And so here, the patish, the hammer itself, mitchalek, is what breaks into many sparks. So you have to this is the analogy of a hammer that's hitting an anvil and many sparks come out. And the nimshal is the person who's making the derashot and analyzing the pesukim is like the patish, right? So we come and we say, what is this pasuk? The anvil is the pasuk, and as we confront the pasuk, say, what does this mean? Right? We're kind of challenging it to say, let's try to figure out what this means and break apart the pasuk into its pieces. What does this word mean? What does this letter mean? We don't break the pasuk, so that's why the analogy is not exactly the same as in the pasuk. In the pasuk it says the hammer is going to break the rock, but we don't want to smash the pasuk. So the point is that the pasuk stays whole, like the anvil stays whole, but what emerges is from that interaction of the reader and the pasuk is multiple sparks, and the sparks are the meanings, the laws, the explanations that come from it. So just like a hammer breaks into many sparks, so too one pasuk can, from one pasuk can emerge many explanations. So notice only the principle of polysemy is here. And in fact, if you look throughout Tana'itic Midrashim, the principle of polysemy is always there. We say, here's one explanation, here's another one, right? Or if you want, I could bring another one. It brings many explanations for one pasuk. But the principle of non-redundancy is actually not found in Tana'itic Midrashim, but is very prominent in the Talmud Bavli. And notice here that it's not said by Rabbi Ishmael, but only by Abaye. So there's like a whole new level of methodology that is found in throughout the Talmud Bavli. Okay, now we're going to ask, can you give me an example of where you have one law that we learn from multiple Pesukim? And of course, this would be a problem if we had such a thing, because then you'd have to have a challenge. And it could be as different opinions. One says we learn it from here, one says we learn it from here. But can you give me an example of one law where different sages learn the same one law from two different Pesukim? So we're going to try out three different possibilities. Amar Rav Zavid, Kiditnan, Mizbeach, Mekadesh, et hara'ui lo. Okay, we're going to learn this from a Mishnah Zevachim. Rav Zavi is going to answer the question. I'm going to give you an example. And this Mishnah Zevachim says that the Mizbeach makes holy that which is suited for it. What we're talking about is if you have an animal that's fit to be a korban. Okay, good. So we bring it into the courtyard and we're going to prepare it to be a korban. We're not talking about an animal that's terefa or avodah zarah animal, one that has to be killed. We're talking about an animal that is fit to be a korban. So we bring it in, and then during the processing, during the slaughter of it, the kohen or the person who's slaughtering it has the wrong intention, or they don't collect the blood, or they don't sprinkle the blood. There's something wrong with the service done in the courtyard. Now that korban officially is pasul, and you're not supposed to bring it on the mizbeach. However, if you did b'di'avad bring it on the mizbeach, you can leave it there. That's what it means, that the mizbeach, it makes holy that which is fitting for it, as long as it's fitting for it initially when it comes into the courtyard. So then b'di'avad you can leave it there. If not, if it's a terefa, then you have to take it down from the mizbeach, even if you put it up there. So that's the law. Now we have two different derivations for it. Rabbi Yoshua Omer kol hara'ui la'ishim im ala lo yered shneimar ha'olah al mokedah. Ma olah shi re'uya la'ishim im alta lo tered af kol shehu ra'ui la'ishim im ala lo tered. Rabbi Yoshua says anything that is fitting for the fire. So he's focusing on the fire itself. If it goes up and is placed on the fire, then don't take it down. As the pasuk says in Vayikra, ha'olah, so that's referring to an olah offering, al mokedah, on the fire. Just like an olah offering is something that is fit for fire, that's what you do with it, you put it on the fire. So, and if you put it up, then you don't bring it down, you can't take it down, all right, it has to be all burnt. So too, anything that is fit for the fire, even if it becomes pasul during the blood service, if you put it up, you're not supposed to put it up because pasul, lecha techila. But b'di'avad, if you put it on the fire, then you can leave it there because it was an animal that was fit to be a korban. That's Rabbi Yoshua's derivation. Rabban Gamliel Omer, kol hara'oi lamizbeach im ala lo yered. He just changes one thing. Instead of for fire, he says anything that's fit for the mizbeach. We'll see why this makes a difference. Shenemar hi ha'olah al mokedah al hamizbeach. He quotes the same pasuk, but he quotes two more words. Not just hi ha'olah al mokedah, the olah that goes on the fire, but rather goes on the fire on the mizbeach. Ma olah shi re'uya legabe mizbeach im alta lo tered, av kol shu ra'ui lemizbeach im ala lo yered. Just like a korban olah that is fit to go onto the altar, if you put it on, you're not allowed to take it off. So too, anything that is fit to be on the altar, even if it became pasul while they were preparing the blood and preparing the animal, nevertheless, if you put it on b'di'avad, you do not take it down. So you see that they seem to be deriving the same law. What are they coming to include when they say, if it goes up, don't take it down? They're including pesulin, animals, sacrificial animals that were fit to be a sacrifice when they came into the courtyard, but then became pasul during the processing. So you see, they agree. And yet, one, Rabbi Yoshua learns it from the word mokedah. And Rabban Gamliel learns it from the word mizbeach. They're both in the same pasuk, but still they're different words in the same pasuk. And this would be an example of learning one law from two different pasukim, or two different words in a pasuk. And only one of them could be correct. And so, if we stuck with this, then we'd have to say, well, according to you, what will we do with the other word? Well, according to this Tana, what will he do with the other word? But now we reject this example. והאטם מפלג פליגה דקתני ספר אין בין דברי רבן גמליאל לדברי רבי יהושע אלא הדם והנסחים שרבן גמליאל אומר לא ירדו ורבי יהושע אומר ירדו. In fact, these two Tanaim are arguing not only about the source, but also about the law. As the continuation of that Mishnah says, there is no difference between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua in practicality, except for, so there is a difference between them, blood and wine libations. That according to Rabban Gamliel, those also, if you put them up, they don't come down. Rabbi Yehoshua says, if you put them up, they do come down. What's the difference? Well, because blood, what do you do with blood? You don't put it on the fire. Blood is dabbed on the side of the Mizbeach. And wine that's for Yayin Nesech, does not go on the fire. You don't pour wine on the fire. Rather, the wine would be poured into channels, into holes on top of the Mizbeach, and would go down into channels down all the way underneath. And so these things were not put on the fire. Therefore, according to the Rabbi Yehoshua, who learns this halacha from fire, this halacha only applies to animals that are actually placed on the fire. That if you put it up, then you leave it there and don't take it down. But if it was blood or wine and there was a problem with the processing of it, and then you bring it up, you say, what are you doing there? That's pasul. Take it down, according to the Rabbi Yehoshua. According to Rabban Gamliel, who learns from the word mizbeach, well, wine and blood are offered on the Mizbeach. Not on the fire, it's true, but they are on the Mizbeach. And therefore, the same law applies to them, that if there's a problem with their processing and their pesulin, you shouldn't bring it up. But b'diavad, if you did bring it up onto the Mizbeach, then you offer it and you do not bring it down. So you see, they're actually not learning the same law. So this is not a good example of one law that's being learned from two different Pesukim, because depending on the Pasuk that you learn it from, you actually come out with a different law. So it is a machloket, but it's not an example of the same law from two different Pesukim. Ela Amara Papa, so we have another candidate, Gedetanya. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili Omer, Mitoch shene'emar, Kol HaNogea BaMizbeach Yikdash. There's pasuk in Shemot that says, anything that touches the altar will become holy. This is related to the same halacha that we were just talking about. That's something that was pasul, but now you brought it onto the Mizbeach, leave it there. So, Shomea ani ben ra'ui ben she'eno ra'ui. Tamod lomar kebasim, ma kebasim re'uyin af kol ra'ui. Now, if I just had this pasuk by itself, I might think whether it's something that is fit to be offered or even not fit. Meaning, let's say, even an animal that's not fit to be a korban at all, because it's just a terefa. I might think that if I put that in mizbech, then I leave it there. No, that's why it says kevasim. Kevasim, a lamb, just like a lamb is something that's fit to be a korban, so too, anything that's fit to be a korban. So certainly not a non-kosher animal, or not an animal like a kebes that's not kosher, like a terefa, that if you bring it up, you have to take it down. We're not talking about that. But rather, if it's an animal that's fit to be a sacrifice, like a sacrificial lamb, and there's only a problem with the processing, then you bring it up and you leave it there. So it's a similar law to what we were just talking about, but deriving it from a different pasuk altogether. Rabbi Akiva omer ola, ma ola re'uya af kol ra'ui. So you see that Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, and the beginning of this baraita, learns it from the word kebasim, that's in the very next pasuk. Kol ha'nogea b'mizbeach yikdash is in pasuk 37. Next pasuk, it talks about kebasim. So that's so he learns it has to be ra'ui like kevasim or re'uyim. Rabbi Akiva, however, learns it from a few pesukim later where it talks about olah. There's so much korban tamid here. And it says ma olah re'uya af kol ra'ui, has to be fit for an offering. And just as a problem with the processing, even though when it came to the courtyard, it was a perfectly good animal, fit for to be a mizbeach. And then there's a problem, then if lichatechila you shouldn't bring it up, but b'diavad, if you brought it up, then you can leave it there. Now what are they both excluding from the law. They're excluding disqualified offerings, meaning that if it's not fit to be an offering at all, then you can't bring it. You can't bring it up, and if you bring it up, you have to take it down. And yet they're deriving this very same law from two different pisukim. Rabbi Yosef Galilee learns it from the word kebasim, and Rabbi Akiva learns it from the word olah. So here you go. We have a good example of one law, is one basic law, that something that is totally no good, like a terefa, if you put on mizbeach, you have to take it down. Whereas an animal that is fit to be a sacrifice, but then there's a problem during the processing, shechita, during the gathering of the blood. If there's a problem with that, and it's just disqualified as pasul in that way, then you shouldn't bring it up. But if you do b'diavad, then you leave it up there. So we see that they're learning the same single law from two different pisukim. So this fulfills an example of what we were looking for. But then we say, no, not so. It actually is a practical difference between these two opinions, and that would be an olah of a bird that is pasul. The opinion that learns it from kebasim, that's Rabbi Yosef Gelidi, he would say this leniency that you can leave it up there only applies to animals. You have a good kosher animal that's fit to be a korban, and then there's a problem with the blood, with the shechita or the blood. If it's an animal and you put it up there b'diavad, then you leave it and don't take it down. But if it's a bird, then you take it down, even though there was only a problem during the shechita part, we take it down. But Rabbi Akiva, who learns it from the word olah, that would apply to anything that can be olah, and birds can also be an olah. So he would apply this leniency also to a bird that was a kosher bird, and there was a problem with the shechita, and then you brought it up, then you can leave it up there and you don't have to take it down. So we see that there actually is a practical difference. So this is not one law from two different pisukim. They're actually deriving two different laws from the pisukim. And now there is a machloket, which is the halacha. Okay, so then they'll argue it out and what they do with the other pasuk. But still not an example of the same exact law that you could learn from two pisukim. What we're showing here is that it's really difficult to find such an example because there's always going to be a subtlety depending on where you learn it from. That context of the word and pasuk that you learn it from is going to inform on how the halacha develops and how the halacha is applied. And so how can you have a case of the exact same law with no practical differences, even though they're learned from two different pisukim? So here, let's try again. Ela amarav ashe kedetanya dam yechashev laishahu dam shafach lerabot et hazorek divrei Rabbi Ishmael. This pasuk is said in the context of someone who brings an animal and does shechita outside Ohel Moed. The law in Vayikra is whenever you do shechita on an animal, it has to be as a sacrifice, and a sacrificial animal has to be slaughtered in front of Ohel Moed. You cannot do it outside. In the time of Bet HaMikdash, that would mean in the courtyard of Bet HaMikdash, and you cannot do it outside. If someone slaughters a sacrificial animal away from Ohel Moed, it's dam yechashev, he gets karet. Now, why the repetition and dam shafach? Why didn't he do that also? Rabbi Ishmael learns from this. This comes to include someone who sprinkles blood outside of the Ohel Moed. Someone takes this animal and he does shechita far from Ohel Moed. That's one count. And let's say he takes blood and then sprinkles it on some mizbeach outside of Ohel Moed. That's two counts. This is a second prohibition, a second liability. That's Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer o zebach o zabach lerabot et hazorek. Rabbi Akiva says, I agree with the same law, but I learned it from the same paragraph in the same context. A few pisukim later says if someone brings olah o zabach, why need those extra words olah o zabach, and he does it outside of Ohel Moed? So that word o zabach is coming to include someone who sprinkles blood outside of Ohel Moed, that person also gets a punishment. So v'tarvaihu ma'ika merabu zerika. What are they both coming to include? Not only slaughter, which the Pesukim say explicitly, but also sprinkling. Mor ma'itela me dami or mor ma'itela me o zabach. And yet they're learning it from two different Pesukim, one from dami chasheb, that's Rabbi Ishmael, and the other from Ozabach is Rabbi Akiva. So here we have a good example of the same law that's derived from two completely different Pesukim. Hold on, here also there is a practical difference. Because Rabbi Abahu taught that someone, the same person, did shechita on an animal outside of Moed and also sprinkled blood outside Ol Moed. According to Rabbi Ishmael, he would be liable only to one, because Rabbi Ishmael learns it from the same pasuk, so therefore it's only one liability. According to Rabbi Akiva, who learns it from two different pasukim, that means there's two transgressions, two liabilities. So actually there is a practical difference. They're not learning the same exact law from two different pasukim. Ha'itmarala amar Abaye af diber Rabbi Akiva name eno chayav ela achat tamar kera sham ta'ale olotecha v'sham ta'aseh arbinu rachamana lechu asiyot. No, we have another statement about that in the opinion of Abaye, who disagrees with Rabbi Abahu, and he says even according to Rabbi Akiva, even though he learns it from two different pasukim, one pasuk is for shechita, one pasuk is for zirika, even Rabbi Akiva agrees that if the same person does both the slaughter and the sprinkling, they are only liable on one count, because the pasuk says there, in the place that Hashem will choose, in Ol Moed or in the Mishkan, in the Bet HaMikdash, wherever it is, there you shall bring up your Olah offerings, and there you shall do them. So you see that we're putting all these actions together. The Rachamana, the Torah, puts together the actions of shechita and the zerika. So since it's combining them all in one, right, all of these actions, therefore even the Rabbi Akiva agrees that there's only one punishment for someone who does both actions. And so finally, we have a good example of how one could possibly derive one law from two different Pesukim. It's the same exact law, and it's from two different Pesukim. That's what we're talking about, and we came to all this because we were saying that we have to write down all the arguments for innocence, because we want to make sure that we don't have an example like this, well, let's say in a capital case, where you have the very same law, and yet one of the judges says, I learned it from this pasuk, and the other judge says, I learned the same law from a different pasuk. Well, then we can only count one of them, because only one of the derivations can be correct, whichever one it is, but they can't both be correct, and therefore we only count one of the votes and not the other. And now we continue with the Mishnah that said, Dine mamonot danin bayom. Regarding monetary cases, you have to start them during the day. But if it extends into the night, you can complete the case at night. That's totally fine for monetary cases. For capital case, you have to begin during the day and you have to end it during the day. The verdict will have to be during the day, and it could be the next day. Whenever it is, you have to extend it. But monetary cases, if it extends into the night, you can give the verdict at night. Siman Mishpat Ma'aneh Mateh. Menahane Mileh. What's the source of this? Amar Bichia Bar Papa, the Amar Kerav Shafetu et Ha'am Bechol Et. The pasuk in the Yitro says you should get together people that will help you, Moshe, and they will judge the people at all times. We learn from here that you can judge people anytime, day or night. Well, if so, that you can judge people anytime, then why can't you begin at night? כדרבה רמה, כתיב ושפטו את העם בכל עת, וכתיב היה ביום הנחילו את בניו הכסד, יום לתחילת דין, לילה לגמר דין. The answer is what Rava said. Rava brought a contradiction between two pesukim. One, the pasuk we just quoted, that the judges will judge people at any time, day or night. But there's another pasuk regarding inheritance, and it says on the day that someone gives an inheritance to his children. An inheritance is a type of monetary law. So, and it says biyom, only during the day. So which one is it? And the answer is, we reconcile them and say, when the pasuk says biyom anchilo, that during the day, that's talking about the beginning of judgment. But the end of judgment, that's the pasuk bechol et, can even be at night. Matnitin de la Our Mishnah that says you can end a monetary case even at night It disagrees with Rabbi Meir, the Tanya. Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, here's a Braita where Rabbi Meir says, al pihem kol ri v'chol naga. Pasuk in Devarim that says that the Kohanim, Halviyim, they will adjudicate any dispute and leprous sore. And the Peshat, Riv is referring to some fight between people. Naga is referring to a blow, an injury. But in the Midrash, Riv is talking about a monetary case, and Naga is referring to a case of sarat, where the Kohen has to examine it to see if it's tahor or tameh. V'chi ma inyan rivim el sanegaim. Now, why is the pasuk putting these two different cases together? One a monetary case and one about tumah and tahara. Ela makish rivim lenegaim. It's putting them together so that we will compare them and learn some of the details of the laws of one to the other. Manegim bayom dichtibu b'yom heraot bo af rivim bayom. Just like the examining skin diseases has to only be during the day, which makes sense. At night, there's no light, maybe a little candle, but you need good light to make sure to examine the leprous sore properly. So too, monetary cases have to be during the day. So here we see that Rabbi Meir says monetary cases have to be during the day, the whole time. The beginning and the end have to be during the day. So you see, Rabbi Akiva does not agree with the author of our Mishnah that says you can end monetary cases at night. We further compare the manegim shelo besomin, tichtib lechol mar'eh ayneh hakohen, afribin shelo besomin. Just like cases of negaim cannot be adjudicated by a blind kohen. Obviously, when he has to see it, to see what it looks like. Is it white? Is it yellow? Is it what is it? So a blind person couldn't do that, as the pasuk says. For whatever the Kohen sees with his eyes, so too monetary cases cannot be adjudicated by a blind judge. Even though monetary cases, they don't necessarily have to look at anything, but because of the juxtaposition, we learn the same law. And thirdly, makish negaim leribim, maribim shelo bikrobim, af negaim shelo bikrobim. We learn something the other way, that just like regarding monetary cases, someone who's a relative cannot be a judge because they have what to gain. So too, regarding leprous sores, a kohen who is a relative cannot judge his relative's skin disease to decide what it is. And so that's one way that we learn it in the other direction. Now the Braita continues and says, you might argue and say, just like a monetary case, you need 3 judges. Maybe also for skin diseases, you need 3 judges to look at the person's skin and see what it is. And in fact, you can learn that would be so from a kal vachomer. If regarding a person's money, which is less important, you need 3 judges. Regarding his body itself, all the more so you'd need 3 judges. So why don't we learn that? Talmud Lomar v'huba el Aharon HaKohen or el Echad min achav HaKohanim. Halamadeta she'afilu Kohen Echad ro'eh et hanegaim. No, because we have a pasuk that says if someone sees something suspicious on his skin, he brings it to Aharon HaKohen or to one of the other Kohanim. It explicitly says one. So we see from here that one Kohen can examine a nega, and you don't need 3. So that's a difference between them. And so we see from this Baraita that our Mishnah says you can end the monetary case at night, but Rabbi Meir says, no, it has to all be during the day. And now a story. Hahu samya dava b'shibut Rabbi Yochanan dava da'in dina vela amar le Rabbi Yochanan vela midi. There was a blind person who was in the neighborhood of Rabbi Yochanan, and he would judge monetary cases, and Rabbi Yochanan did not stop him. So evidently, Rabbi Yochanan thinks it's okay for a blind person to be a judge for monetary cases. That would disagree with Rabbi Meir. Hechi abid hachi. Now, how could Rabbi Meir do it? How could Rabbi Yochanan do that? V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam mishnah. Utnan kol hakasher ladun kasher la'id. V'yesh shekasher la'id ve'en kasher ladun. V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan latuyes soma be'achat me'enav. After all, Rabbi Yochanan himself said that we follow the Stam Mishnah, an anonymous Mishnah. Halacha follows that opinion. And there is, in fact, a Stam Mishnah in Masechet Nida, where it says anyone who's fit to be a judge certainly is fit to be a witness. The standards to be a judge are higher than that of being a witness. And however, the other way around is not true. There is an example of someone who can be a judge but cannot be a witness. And Rabbi Yochanan explained that Mishnah, that's talking about a blind person, with one eye. He's blind in one eye. He can be a witness, because he has one eye, so he can see a crime or a monetary thing, a transaction, and he can come to court and talk about it. So he can be a judge, he can be a witness, but he cannot be a judge. That's what Rabbi Yochanan explained, this Stam Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan says halacha is like Stam Mishnah, which would mean that a blind person cannot be a judge in monetary cases. So how come Rabbi Yochanan did not stop the judge in his city from adjudicating monetary cases? That's the question. The answer is Rabbi Yochanan said, because Rabbi Yochanan relied on a different anonymous Mishnah. That's our Mishnah here in this chapter in Sanhedrin that says monetary cases can be you have to start them during the day, but you can finish them at night. And at night, nobody can see. So if you can adjudicate monetary cases at night, then that would mean that a blind person also can adjudicate monetary cases. And also, our Mishnah does not follow the Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yochanan says we follow a Stam Mishnah. And so you see that Rabbi Yochanan, he had two different Stam Mishnayot that disagree with each other. And although one is against him, the one that is like Rabbi Meir says one thing, and Rabbi Yochanan says halacha is like that. But there's another Stam Mishnah, so Rabbi Yochanan could rely on that one. We have two different Stam Mishnah to say two different things. So Rabbi Yochanan chose one over the other. Now we ask, now why is this Stam Mishnah stronger than the other one? Why did he pick one over the other? Maybe he should have picked the one in Masechet Nida. Two answers. One is that a Stam Mishnah that follows a majority is better than a Stam Mishnah that follows a minority opinion. The Mishnah in Masechet Nida, we just proved, follows the opinion only of Rabbi Meir. So even though it's said anonymously, we know it's only the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So that has less authority than the Stam Mishnah here in Masechet Sanhedrin that we know actually follows the majority opinion. So knowing the derivation of who said who is the Stam will help, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan chose our Mishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin. Or another answer, it's better to use the Mishnah here in Masechet Sanhedrin that is in the context of the laws of judgment. That's what this whole Mishnah is about, the whole Masechet. So this is the proper context. This is the stronger context. In Masechet Nida, it's just brought as a tangent, as a side point. And so since that's not the main context for the laws of courts, so that has less authority than the one in Masechet here in Masechet Sanhedrin, and that's why Rabbi Meir said. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said. I'm not going to follow Rabbi Meir. I'm going to allow a blind judge to adjudicate monetary cases. Rabbi Meir, hi v'shafetu eta'am bechol et, mai darish be. What is Rabbi Meir going to do with that pasuk that we quoted before that said you can judge at all times, but Rabbi Meir says only during the day? So what does he do with that pasuk? Amar Rava yom hame'onan. He says that comes to include a cloudy day. Any time means not only on a sunny day, also on a cloudy day. Ditnan, en ro'im et hanegeim shacharit uben ha'arba'im velo betoch habayit velo beyom hame'onan mipnei shecheha nir'et azah velo besahoram mipnei she'azah nir'et keha. This is a Mishnah Masechet Negaim that said that a kohen is not allowed to look at a sore on the skin early in the morning when it's not very light out, and not late in the afternoon when also it's not very light out. It's already dusk, the sun goes down, and so you can't have a dim light to see it. And also you can't look at it indoors. Even during the day, indoors, there's not going to be light. It has to be outdoors in the sun and not on a cloudy day. This applies to skin diseases that cannot be seen on a cloudy day. You have to see it in the sun. That's true for negaim. It's not true for monetary cases. If it was exactly the same, then you'd say monetary cases also you can't see on a cloudy day. That's why Rabbi Meir uses this pasuk to say when it comes to monetary cases, bechol et, a cloudy day is also fine for negaim. And anyway, back to negaim. The reason why you can't use dim light is because when the light is dim, then a dull white sore will look bright. And that is actually tameh. So we want to make sure to have a brighter light so that this dull one won't look bright. We'll know that it's dull. Furthermore, the Mishnah teaches, Kohen should not look at the leprous sore and judge it in the midday when the sun is very strong, because when it's very bright, when the sun is very bright out, then a bright white spot will look dull, and that would be a mistake the other way, because that really is tameh, and he'll say it's tahor. And therefore, we have to adjudicate it in the late morning or early afternoon, so not midday, not late in the day, not early in the day, and not when it's cloudy. The sun has to be just right so that he can see the shades of color properly. That's what it does with that pasuk. We had another pasuk that says, on the day that someone gives inheritance to his sons. And so we learn from that's a type of monetary case, and it's done only during the day. Now, what is B'meir going to do with that? Because he already learned that you can only adjudicate during the day from a comparison to Negaim. Negaim is during the day, monetary cases are during the day. So he already knows that law. Now, this pasuk that says adjudication of inheritance is during the day, this is an extra pasuk. What will the B'meir learn from it? Hahumi ba'ele lichidetane Rabba bar Chanina kameh de Rav Nachman. V'haya beyom hanchilot bana beyom atam apil nechalot v'atam apil nechalot balayla. He's going to use this for the Baraita that Rabba bar Chanina recited before Rav Nachman. The pasuk says on a day that a father gives an inheritance to his sons. And we learn from that only during the day can one give inheritance to sons, and you cannot do that at night. Amar le, and Rav Nachman responded to that. Ela me'ata man deshri bimama yartun lebene uman deshri belelia la yartun lebene. Does that mean that if someone happens to die during the day, then he can give inheritance to his sons? But if someone happens to die during the night, the person can't decide when they die. So then the sons won't inherit. Is that what you're telling me? So Rav Nachman says, no. Maybe it means as follows. Rav Nachman is explaining the Baraita that Rabba bar Chanina said. Rav Nachman says, you can't mean that. So Rav Nachman is offering what he thinks is the proper explanation of this Baraita. Dilma din nechalot ka'amart detanya v'haita libnei Yisrael lechukat mishpat ur'a kol parasha kola liyot din. Maybe you're talking about the adjudication of inheritance. That's not the inheritance itself. We're not talking about when the father gives his will. The father on his deathbed can give his will during the day or during the night. That doesn't matter, because that's about testimony. That whoever is there will testify, we heard the father say this. That's fine. That can be done day or night. So therefore, if someone dies at night, that's okay. Their sons will still inherit. Rather, what this Baraita is talking about is adjudication by judges. As the Baraita says, that this will be to Bnei Yisrael l'chukat mishpat, and it's in the context of inheritance. And we see that this entire paragraph is considered judgment. And so it's talking about a judgment regarding inheritance. Inheritance law is considered law, and as an example of law, and just like any monetary law has to be done during the day, begun during the day, so too inheritance law has to begin during the day. Rav Rasu kotvin, Rasu osin din. Shenaim kotvin, ve'en osin din. And Rav Nachman is continuing to explain why this is a good explanation of that Baraita. As Rav Yudah said, name of Rav, if three people come to visit a person who was on his deathbed, and then the guy on his deathbed said, listen, while you're here, I want to tell you what my will is, what to do with my inheritance. If they want, they can write it down in a document. In other words, these three people that are coming to visit can act as witnesses and says, okay, we heard you say that. We're going to write it in a document and sign it, then it could be used later in court. Or, since there's three people there, they can be a bet din themselves, and right there they can adjudicate the case. However, if there's only two people that come to visit, shenaim kotvin ve'en osin din, the two people can act as witnesses, and they'll write up a document that they heard the person on his deathbed say this, but they cannot be judges because there's only two and not three. Ve'amar Rav Chisda said something else about this law. Lo shanu ela bayom ava balayla kotvin ve'en osin din mishum davu lehu edim ve'en ed nasa dayan amar le'in hachi kamina. Rav Chisda said that what Rav said over here only applies during the day. During the day, if there's three, then they can decide if they want to be witnesses or judges. But if it's at night, even if there's three, then they have to act as witnesses. And they write it down and they do not make a judgment because they are witnesses. And a witness cannot be a judge. In other words, since it's at night, they can't be judges, they have to be witnesses. Once they're witnesses, they can't act as judges also, because a person cannot be a judge and a witness for the very same thing. So if it's at night, they're going to be witnesses, and that's it, they're going to be witnesses and won't be judges. So we see from here that adjudication of inheritance law has to be during the day. And it must be that's what that baraita meant, right? That when it says during the day, it doesn't mean if someone dies in the nighttime that he can't say a will and have his sons inherit. Even if he dies at night, the people there can be witnesses. Yeah, that can be done day or night. And rather, this baraita is talking about adjudication of a will, of inheritance law, and that has to be done during the day. And after Rav Nachman suggested this interpretation, so Rabbah Bar Chanina said to Rav Nachman, yes, that's exactly what I meant when I told you this baraita, right? Even though he only said the baraita first, Rav Nachman was able to figure out what the correct explanation and application of the baraita is. So we brought all this to say what it would be me'ir to do with this pasuk, Beyom hanchilo et banav, which means it's during the day. And the answer is he's going to derive from here a law specifically about inheritance, that inheritance has to be adjudicated during the day, but witnesses can testify about someone on his deathbed who gave his will even during the night. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.